Chapter 4: A History of Resilience, Oppression. As Ivan and Nadya huddles together in the dim candlelight of the makeshift shelter, the sounds of war raging outside, their thoughts turn to the past. The history of their homeland is one marked by struggle, by oppression, and by the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people in the face of adversity. "Do you remember the stories your didus used to tell us about the Holodomor?" Nadya asks quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. Ivan nods solemnly. "My grandpa, how could I forget? The artificial famine engineered by Stalin in the 1930s. Millions of our people starved to death, all because of the Soviet Union's cruel policies." They recall the harrowing tales their grandparents have shared, of families forced to watch helplessly as loved ones wasted away, of desperate people resorting to eating grass and tree bark just to survive. The Holodomor, a genocide committed against the Ukrainian people, had left an indelible scar on the nation's psyche. As Ivan and Nadya sort through the supplies they have gathered for the makeshift hospital, their minds wander to the stories of their ancestors. The history of Ukraine is a tapestry woven with threads of struggle, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to freedom. "You know, my great-grandmother survived the Holodomor," Nadya remarks as she folds a stack of blankets. "She used to tell me how they had to ration every scrap of food, how people died in the streets from starvation." Ivan pauses, a box of medical supplies in his hands. "My grandparents lived through it too. They said it was like watching the world end, but somehow they endured, just like we will." They work in silence for a moment, the weight of their ancestors suffering heavy on their hearts. Yet, in that suffering, they find a well of strength. If their grandparents could survive the horrors of the Holodomor, then surely they can weather this storm. As they load the supplies into the waiting van, Ivan's thoughts turn to the Orange Revolution. "Remember how excited we were back in 2004? I was just a kid, but I could feel the electricity in the air. People were so hopeful, so determined to change things for the better." Nadya smiles at the memory. "Yeah, and now here we are, doing our part to make a difference. We're not out on the streets waving flags, but this," she gestures to the van full of supplies, "this is our revolution." They climb into the vehicle and set off towards the hospital, navigating streets pockmarked by artillery fire. The spirit of the Orange Revolution, that unshakable belief in the power of the people, drives them forward. As they unload the supplies at the hospital, a woman in a volunteer's uniform approaches them. "Thank you so much," she says, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been running low on everything. You two are lifesavers." Ivan and Nadya exchange a glance, thinking of the brave protesters who have stood their ground on the Maidan in 2014. They too have been lifesavers, putting their bodies on the line to defend their dreams of a better Ukraine. "We're just doing what we can," Ivan replies, shaking the woman's hand. "Like our parents did during Euromaidan, and their parents before them. It's in our blood." As they leave the hospital, Nadya takes Ivan's hand, her grip strong and steady. "We're part of something bigger than ourselves," she says softly, "a story that started long before us and will continue long after we're gone." Ivan agrees, his heart swelling with a fierce love for his country and for the woman beside him. They are the latest chapter in an epic tale of resilience, two more threads woven into the tapestry of Ukraine's history. And as long as there are people like them, people willing to fight for what was right, that tapestry would never unravel. They drive back out into the city, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They draw courage from the stories of their ancestors, from the knowledge that they are part of an unbroken chain of heroes. In the face of bombs and bullets, in the face of an enemy that sought to erase their very identity, they will stand tall. They will endure. They will prevail. "And then there was the Orange Revolution in 2004, Ivan muses. "We were just kids then, but I remember the sense of hope, the feeling that change was possible." Nadya smiles wistfully. "Yes, the protests against election fraud, the sea of orange flags in the streets. Our parents were so passionate about fighting for democracy, for a better future." They reflect on how, even in the face of intimidation and violence from the authorities, the Ukrainian people have stood firm in their demands for fair elections and an end to corruption. The Orange Revolution has been a pivotal moment, a testament to the courage and determination of ordinary citizens. And of course, there was Euromaidan in 2014, Ivan continues. We were old enough then to truly understand what was at stake. Nadia's eyes glistens with unshed tears. The protests against Yanukovych's corrupt regime, the brutal crackdown by the police. So many brave souls lost their lives on the Maidan, fighting for the right to choose our own path. They remember the sense of unity that had swept the nation, the way people from all walks of life have come together to demand dignity, justice, and closer ties with Europe. Euromaidan had been a turning point, a moment when Ukrainians had stood up and declared that they would no longer tolerate the old ways, that they were ready to forge a new future for themselves. And now, in the face of Russian aggression, those same qualities, resilience, courage, a fierce love of freedom, are once again shining through. As Ivan and Nadya look into each other's eyes, they see the reflection of generations of Ukrainians who had fought and sacrificed for their homeland. We come from a long line of survivors, Ivan says softly, taking Nadia's hand in his. Our ancestors endured unimaginable hardships, but they never gave up, and neither will we. Nadya squeezes his hand, a small smile playing on her lips despite the gravity of their situation. You're right, we'll get through this, just like our people always have. And when this war is over, we'll build a Ukraine that would make our grandparents proud. As the night wears on and the sounds of battle eventually faded into an uneasy silence, Ivan and Nadya cling to each other and to the hope that has sustained their nation through centuries of struggle. They know that the road ahead will be long and difficult, but they also know that they have the strength of their ancestors flowing through their veins. Ukraine will endure, as it always had, and they will be there to help shape its future. Memories. The air raid siren has fallen silent, but no one moves to leave the shelter. Instead, they gather around Katerina and Mikhailo as the elderly couple begins sharing stories passed down through generations. Ivan's laptop is open, recording these precious memories, while Nadya translates snippets into English for her international blog. Nadya notices how Katerina's hands tremble slightly as she begins to speak about her grandmother's memories of the Holodomor. My grandmother, Katerina begins, her weathered hands clasped in her lap, survived the Holodomor. She was just a child in 1932, living in a village near Poltava. She told me how the Soviet authorities came and took everything, not just grain, but every scrap of food they could find. That's when the horrors truly started. But you have to understand, it didn't happen by accident. They planned it carefully, systematically. The shelter falls silent. Ivan remembers watching Mr. Jones, the film about Welsh journalist Gareth Jones who exposed Stalin's manufactured famine. But hearing it from someone whose family lived through it makes history tangibly real. His fingers hover over his keyboard, recording every word. These stories, passed down through generations, carry a weight that no historical document can fully capture. First came the grain quotas, Katerina continues, impossible amounts that villages had to provide to the state. When people couldn't meet them, Soviet brigades came and took everything. Everything. Her voice catches. Not just grain. They took the vegetables people had grown, the fruits they'd dried for winter, even the seeds they'd saved for next year's planting. They even took the seeds for next year's planting, Katerina continues. My grandmother said they used long metal rods to probe the ground, looking for where villagers had hidden food. They even took religious icons, thinking people might have hidden food behind them. People ate tree bark, boiled leather, anything they could find. Her older sister died that winter. Their parents gave what little food they had to the younger children. Nadia's grandmother Sofia, who arrived at the shelter yesterday from Bucha, adds her own family's story. My father's family survived by eating tadpoles from the creek and nettles they gathered in secret. The authorities would arrest people for gathering food in the fields, even children. They called it stealing state property. But why? Asks a young girl, her face pale in the shelter's dim light. To break us, Katerina replies firmly. To destroy the Ukrainian peasantry, our culture, our independence. They called us kulaks, enemies of the state, said we were hoarding food, sabotaging the Soviet system. But the truth was, they wanted to remake Ukraine in their image, and they were willing to starve millions to do it. But people helped each other, Mikhailo interjects. My grandfather told me about the women in his village who would add sawdust to what little flour they had, making it go further so they could share with neighbors. They would leave tiny bundles of food in agreed-upon places, helping others while avoiding detection. The parallels to their current situation, sharing resources, secret coordination, resistance to oppression, aren't lost on anyone in the shelter. Sophia pulls out an old photograph from her purse, a family portrait from 1943. This was taken just before the Nazis retreated. See my aunt here? She was part of the underground resistance. They helped Jews escape, passed information to partisans in the forests. After the war, the Soviets arrested her for nationalist activities. Stark black and white images of the period. Empty villages, children with swollen bellies, mass graves, but also images of resistance, families who shared what little they had, communities that tried to help each other survive. My grandmother's village was near Kharkiv, Sophia continues. She told me how people tried to reach the cities where there was still some food, but they set up roadblocks. Internal passports were required. Peasants couldn't leave their villages without permission, which was never granted. They were literally trapped in zones of death. Our people have always resisted, Katerina says firmly. During the Soviet era, we preserved our language, our songs, our stories, even when it was forbidden. Have you heard of the 60 Years movement? Ivan nods eagerly. The poets and artists who defended Ukrainian culture in the 1960s. Vasyl Stus, Lena Kostenko. Ivan thinks of the documentary they'd watched, of Gareth Jones walking through empty villages, discovering the truth that many Western journalists, like Walter Duranty of the New York Times, chose to deny. They tried to hide it from the world, he says, and largely succeeded. Yes, Katerina smiles. I was young then, but I remember the Samvidov, secret publications we passed hand to hand. It became forbidden even to speak of it. If someone died of hunger, the official cause was listed as acute vitamin deficiency or exhaustion. But people remembered. They had to remember. People wrote poems, essays, protests against Russification. The KGB arrested many, sent them to labor camps, but still people wrote, still they spoke out. But there were acts of resistance, Sophia adds. My grandfather told me about villagers who would leave tiny bundles of food in secret places for others to find. Women who added ground bark to stretch what little flour they had, sharing bread with neighbors. People who smuggled grain in their clothes, knowing they would be shot if caught. A young volunteer who has been listening intently speaks up. My grandfather was in the Ukrainian Helsinki group in the 1970s. They documented human rights violations, demanded independence. He spent 5 years in Siberia for it. The shelter falls silent as they absorb these stories. Outside, the sounds of war continue, but somehow they seem less threatening compared to the quiet brutality of the Holodomor. Nadya, who has been quietly translating these stories, looks up from her notebook. We learned about some of this in school, but not everything. So much of our history was suppressed, rewritten. That's why we must remember, Sophia says urgently. Each generation's resistance builds on what came before. The parents who taught their children Ukrainian when it was forbidden, the dissidents who went to prison rather than deny their identity, the farmers who hid food during Holodomor, they all led to the Orange Revolution, to Maidan, to today. The most important thing to remember, Nadya adds, her voice strengthening, is that they didn't succeed in breaking us. Yes, they killed millions. The exact number we may never know. But Ukraine survived. Our language survived. Our culture survived. Even in the darkest times, people found ways to help each other, to maintain their humanity. That's why documenting everything is so important now, so no one can deny or hide what's happening. And why we keep sharing food and supplies, Ivan injects into the conversation, glancing at their volunteer operation with a hint of pride in his face and his voice. Because that's who we are. That's who we've always been. I've been taught to never waste a crumb of food, and also to never stop sharing what we had with others. This is our victory over the terror, maintaining our humanity, our generosity, even after everything they did to try to destroy it. As if to emphasize his point, Someone brings out a loaf of fresh bread to share among the shelter's occupants. The simple act of breaking bread together takes on a deeper meaning in light of these memories. In the shelter, the stories of the Holodomor serve not just as historical memory, but as testament to the Ukrainian spirit of resistance and survival. They remind everyone that their current struggle is part of a longer story, one of endurance in the face of attempted annihilation, of maintaining dignity even in the darkest times. An explosion in the distance briefly interrupts the storytelling. When it passes, Ivan looks at the document on his laptop screen, now filled with generations of memories. These stories, he says, they're not just about suffering. They're about survival, about maintaining humanity in inhuman conditions. About finding ways to resist that don't require weapons, Nadya adds, thinking of their volunteer network, their information sharing systems, their efforts to preserve truth in the face of propaganda. Katerina nods approvingly. Now you understand. Every time they tried to destroy us, through famine, through deportation, through Russification, we found ways to survive, to maintain our identity, to help each other. That's what makes us Ukrainian. Sophia begins humming an old partisan song, one that was once sung in forest hideouts and labor camps. Others join in, the melody carrying centuries of defiance, survival, and unwavering hope for freedom. These stories of past resistance offer both guidance and hope. They remind everyone that their current struggle is part of a longer journey, one that has seen darker days and emerged stronger. As another air raid siren begins its wail, the people of the shelter draw strength from this knowledge, understanding that they too are writing a chapter in Ukraine's long history of resilience. Winter of Fire. Ivan's laptop screen casts a blue glow in the shelter as he pulls up the documentary Winter of Fire. Nadya sits beside him, their shoulders touching. Around them, several others gather, some who lived through those days, some too young to remember clearly. I was there, Ivan says quietly, as the opening scenes show the first peaceful protests in November 2013. My band was supposed to play at a cafe near Maidan that week. We ended up performing for the protesters instead. On screen, students gather with Ukrainian flags and EU banners, their faces bright with hope as they protest Yanukovych's refusal to sign the European Union Association Agreement. Nadia's hand finds Ivan's in the darkness. I remember that first night, she says, November 21st. It was so peaceful. We thought it would be like 2004, singing, dancing, showing our support for Europe. None of us imagined what was coming. The documentary shows the growing crowds, the student encampment, the festive atmosphere of those early days. Then comes the footage from November 30th, the brutal pre-dawn assault by Berkut riot police on sleeping students. I wasn't there that night. Ivan's voice is heavy with old guilt. But I heard the news and ran to Maidan. By the time I arrived, thousands were already gathering. The violence against the students changed everything. Nadya nods. I was working at a makeshift medical point by St. Michael's Monastery. The Golden Domed Church opened its gates to protect the fleeing students. All night, they kept coming, young people with bloody faces, broken bones, but they came back to Maidan the next day. We all did. The shelter falls silent as the documentary shows the transformation of Maidan Nezalezhnosti. Barricades rise from snow and ice. Ordinary people don helmets and body armor fashioned from whatever materials they can find. The Christmas season arrives, and a piano painted in Ukraine's national colors appears on the barricades, a professor playing Chopin while smoke rises in the background. Look, Nadya points to a scene of volunteers preparing food. That's the kitchen where I worked. We served thousands of meals each day. Everyone brought what they could: bread, vegetables, warm clothes. Babusi would arrive with pots of soup and words of encouragement. Ivan's fingers trace the scar on his arm, barely visible in the dim light. January 16th, he says, as the documentary shows the passage of the anti-protest laws. They called them the dictatorship laws. Suddenly, everything we were doing became illegal, gathering in groups, wearing helmets, even setting up medical stations. The footage grows darker. Burning barricades on Hrushevsky Street, the first deaths of protesters, the bitter cold of January giving way to the bloody days of February. The soundtrack swells with the haunting Plive Kasha, the duck is swimming, the song that became a requiem for the fallen. I can still smell the burning tires, Nadya whispers. We used the smoke as cover from the snipers. February 20th, her voice breaks. The documentary shows the worst day of violence when dozens were killed by sniper fire on Institutska Street. The Heavenly Hundred, someone in the shelter says softly. On screen, images of the fallen protesters appear. Students, teachers, artists, workers. Heroes who gave their lives for Ukraine's European future. Ivan pauses the documentary. You know what I remember most? The mobile phone alerts. We'd get messages, need helmets on Hrushevsky, medical help needed near October Palace, bring tires to the barricades. Everyone did what they could. Engineers built catapults. Doctors set up field hospitals. IT specialists created online coordination systems. And now the Russians reap the benefits while we bleed. Nadia's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. They can't erase the truth, Ivan. No matter how hard they try, the world knows what they've done. Crimea is Ukrainian, and it always will be. Ivan looked down at their clasped hands, drawing strength from her touch. She was right, he knew. The road ahead would be long and hard, but they would not stop fighting. Not until every inch of Ukrainian soil was free from the invaders' grasp. One day, he said softly, his eyes meeting hers, we'll walk on the beaches of Crimea again. We'll rebuild what was lost, honor those who were taken from us, and the world will remember the truth, the real history of this land. Nadya nodded, her eyes distant as she recalled the events of 2014. I remember watching the news, seeing those unmarked Russian soldiers, Zeleny Cholovitsky, the little green men, swarming into Crimea. It was surreal, like something out of a movie. Ivan's jaw clenched at the memory. And then that sham referendum, the one where they claimed 97% of Crimeans voted to join Russia. As if anyone could believe that, with armed men watching over the polling stations. The worst part was how quickly it all happened, Nadya said, her voice tight with emotion. One day Crimea was part of Ukraine, and the next it was gone, just like that. Annexed by Russia in complete violation of international law. They both fell silent for a moment, remembering the shock and outrage that had swept through Ukraine as the nation watched a piece of its territory being stolen in broad daylight. The annexation of Crimea had been a blatant act of aggression, a stark reminder of Russia's willingness to trample on Ukraine's sovereignty. And the world just let it happen, Ivan said bitterly. A few condemnations, some sanctions, but in the end, nothing changed. Crimea is still occupied, and now Russia is trying to do the same thing in Donbass. Nadya squeezed his hand, her grip warm and reassuring. They may have taken Crimea, but they'll never take our spirit. We won't let them. Crimea is Ukraine, and one day we'll make that a reality again. Ivan's frustration built even further, drawing strength from her conviction. Do you know what upsets me the most? He asks in a rhetorical way, not expecting an answer. That Russia agreed to the borders of Ukraine that included Crimea. In the 1994's Budapest Treaty, both parties recognize each other's territorial integrity and the inviolability of existing borders. Russia further promised not to use force against territorial integrity of Ukraine. If only Russia ever lived by its agreements and its own laws, he ended with a sigh of frustration and sadness. The annexation of Crimea had been a terrible blow, but it had also galvanized Ukrainians, fueling their determination to resist Russian aggression at all costs. They would never forget, and they would never stop fighting for what was rightfully theirs. They walked in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The annexation of Crimea had been a shocking blow to Ukraine's sovereignty, a blatant violation of international law. And now, history seemed to be repeating itself in the Donbass region, with Russian-backed separatists waging a bloody war against the Ukrainian government.